So Flynn Berry has authored psychological thrillers, including Under the Harrow, A Double Life, and of course, Northern Spy. Her work has been translated into 17 languages, and I have observed that neither she nor Sarah seems to be able to keep their names off of the New York Times bestseller list or the Reese Witherspoon book club list. Sarah's debut novel was, of course, instantly on the aforementioned list, and her short fiction has been both widely published and shortlisted for several prizes. She's an author who is consistently inspired by place, which is abundantly clear in this very immersive and transporting prose. Our second adventure tonight that we're going to be talking about with Detective Elin Warner is every bit as chilling and unputdownable as the first. Reviews so far have used the phrases heart pounding, heart stopping, atmospheric, twisty, and tense. It truly is a wild ride, and RJ Julia and Wesley and RJ Julia are so grateful to have these two in conversation today. So with that, I'm going to let them take it away.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm so excited to be talking to Sarah tonight about her wonderful new book. I got to read an early copy of it, and I felt sort of giddy with joy. Everyone who's already read it will understand this, but the week I was reading it was made so much better by being able to escape into her world again every night. I was just rushing through bedtime and chores with my kids so I could get to it. And I have so many questions. I guess I want to start by asking, I love hearing how you describe your books in your own words. So I was wondering if you could tell us about The Retreat.
Yeah, of course. So the retreat takes place at a luxury retreat on a remote island. And I think probably actually just holding up the book kind of gives a sense, I suppose, of the island itself, which I think is sort of really important to the novel. You have this sort of very luxe retreat here and almost the juxtaposition with the very sort of wild side of the island. It's a wellness retreat, so you kind of have all of the usual pursuits on offer from sort of yoga, paddleboarding, hiking, that kind of thing. And we follow a group of guests, a kind of quite an unusual family group. They're a little bit estranged. And this sort of vacation or holiday is a chance for them to get to know each other again. We have some sisters and we have a cousin and their partners. But yeah, the island itself is a bit of a creepy backstory, once home to a serial killer and also a boarding school for unruly boys. And yeah, we also have the character of Detective Elin Warner, who's returning from the sanatorium. And there's a bit of an interesting dynamic because actually her partner, Will, who's an architect, actually designed the retreat named Lumen. So yeah, there's already a bit of sort of personal background there. And she's called to the island when a woman's body falls from the rocks below the yoga pavilion. Initially, it just seems like it's a fall, but yeah, Ellen soon finds out it's anything but.
Yeah, the way you describe it is so delicious, always. I think with the sanatorium, you had this really lovely, icy, chilly texture and this unbelievably rich atmosphere. And then you have something similar in the retreat, but instead it's a heat wave. It's this kind of like sun damage, heat stroke, wildly different in terms of some aspects, but then it seems like you just hit this bullseye both times in terms of finding a place that had a really interesting backstory, a really dark past, a really gorgeous and transporting present or natural landscape. I was wondering how that process is for you. Like, do you travel a lot? How do you find these locations that become such a huge part of your novels?
Oh yeah, in the sanatorium, it was a place actually I'd lived. So it's a place I kind of travel to regularly now out in Switzerland. But it was, yeah, a place I'd lived and I kind of felt really viscerally. I kind of moved there in my early 20s and I was genuinely transported by the landscape. It's something so different to where I live here in the UK by the coast. And yeah, it was just kind of the kickoff idea for it was obviously to become my debut. And yeah, I just felt immediately, I suppose, a visceral sensation about the landscape. I found it beautiful, but also kind of quite wild and scary. And I think this probably has something in common actually with the retreat. The retreat's based on somewhere where I live. So the island itself is a real island, though slightly smaller in scale and closer to sort of the mainland. But again, kind of the sea and that landscape, I find kind of hugely, yeah, wild and actually quite scary. It's immensely beautiful, but that juxtaposition between sort of beauty and the sort of total wildness is just something I'm always drawn to. And yeah, I can't say anything about book 3, but it's a similar thing again there. I find, yeah, just traveling and finding places that kind of evoke a feeling in me, I suppose, is key for my books.
And with this one, so it was closer to home. So how did that inform your research process? Like, were you kayaking out to check out the island or were you taking walks along the coast?
yeah, kind of a mixture, I suppose, of when you live somewhere. I think the landscape is kind of imprinted on you a little bit. I think I kind of definitely sort of took my notebook to kind of certain areas in the book that inspired me and that kind of feature in the novel. But I think certain scenes in how I describe the sea, how I describe kind of beaches are just part of me, probably because I know them sort of so well. But yeah, definitely I kayak a lot, and kind of all of the experience of sort of walking around the coastline, the South Devon coast path sort of came into play. But one of the aspects of the book, which is the boarding school for kind of unruly boys, this was something I sort of learnt about quite early on in the sort of process. I was researching local history, and yeah, I kind of found out there was a boarding school actually kind of almost a 2-minute walk from my house. And I went down a bit of a Google rabbit hole, Reddit thread sort of about the sort of idea of the institution of this boarding school, and some of the sort of quite terrifying discipline practices that were there. So yeah, it's a mixture of sort of, I guess, knowing the place and then research as well.
Yeah, and with that aspect and the historical aspects, you've talked a bit about how people nowadays seem kind of obsessed with moving forward and looking to the future and pretending that you can kind of paper over the past. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit in terms of the retreat and the actual space that's built on the island.
Yeah, I think where we have Will, I suppose, who's Ellen's partner, he's an architect. And I think as an architect, you obviously are looking to the past sort of for reference, but also very much looking to the future. And it's something that's kind of, I suppose, in parallel with their relationship, the kind of bit of a struggle, I suppose. We have Will always sort of looking forward and Ellen kind of drawn back to the past. And yeah, it's something I'm really interested in. And I think in our local landscape, quite often we have a few sort of, I suppose, arguments between sort of planners and things about what do we do to reference the past versus moving on. And that's something in the retreat I think we see a lot. We've got this beautiful sort of new building, and the kind of people involved in building it are struggling to reference what went on there. And that for me, yeah, is hugely interesting and something I sort of explored in the sanatorium as well. I'm a big believer in that kind of the energy of the past and everything that happened is still there. I don't think you kind of can paper over it. And yeah, that sort of mirrors what happens with the characters, I suppose, and their sort of secrets and lies as well.
Yeah, and so being able to sort of tap into that spooky atmosphere, or you use the word creepy with the sanatorium in this, which I love. And then I was wondering, how does that affect you? So you write these really visceral scenes where it feels like you're almost method acting, that you're so deeply in Ellen's shoes, you're experiencing her fear, you're following right up against her skin. And I was wondering, does your research ever terrify you, or sort of how deeply you're living through those scenes? Does it change how you're seeing the landscape when you're just in your normal life?
Yeah, most definitely. I think how I kind of write, I suppose I am, like you say, it's method acting. You are there and you're in the moment and you're kind of feeling everything. And definitely it made me look, particularly, actually, I would say kind of when I'm out on the water, it made me look at the landscape and the island in a different way. And I suppose you're looking at it from a writer's eye. So you're kind of looking, where are the danger points, particularly kind of caves, all of the sort of rocky outcrops that feature in the book and that kind of thing. But yeah, it has made me sort of slightly scared. And I think as an author, when you sort of take that inside of you feel it all the time. And I think I probably look at things through Ellen's eyes. Surprisingly, a lot of people kind of say, do you leave that character behind? And perhaps because it's a continuing character, I often find myself feeling, how would Ellen react to that situation? There's definitely kind of parts of her in me, but she's a new person as well. And I think I still carry Ellen sometimes, which is a weird experience.
Yeah, I love that so much. I heard you mention that. It reminded me, there's a book called A Ghost in the Throat I really loved by an Irish writer, and she talks about feeling completely haunted by her character, and like the character is just a shadow at her side at all times. I was wondering, can you think of any specific times when you've sort of thought, oh, how would Ellen be reacting to this moment in my daily life?
Yeah, definitely. I think even just as I was sort of planning scenes, when I was kind of sort of running the coast path, we have a scene kind of opening the book where Ellen's kind of sort of looking at the drop. I think Ellen as a character, she's probably more fearful than I am. I think there is, anxieties definitely that I share with Ellen, but I think she's sort of constantly on high alert. So I think kind of when I'm just in my general surroundings, I'm sort of thinking, how would Ellen react to that? And actually, even on boat trips kind of we take in the summer, there's one where kind of Ellen sort of heads out to the island. And yeah, it wasn't particularly a research trip at all, but kind of I was writing the book at the time and I was thinking, again, how would Ellen sort of experience that situation? And I think she sort of picks up on detail perhaps I wouldn't, which is interesting, and I think sort of opened my eyes, I suppose, to looking at things how she would. I'm probably more aware of danger now, which is probably no bad thing.
Yeah, it's like hyper vigilance to let you imagine. It's so interesting. It is sometimes I think that instead of writing thrillers, I should write something about like a pastry chef in Italy. My research should be just like that's like really cheery and really bright. Because it is funny how those darknesses kind of seep back and forth across your life. With Elin also, so she's similar to you in some ways. You said she's also a detective, which you are not. I was wondering if you could tell us your research for that and how you got so deeply into detective shoes.
Yeah, I don't know anyone that's a detective. I know some authors kind of either have a background or kind of know anyone, but I actually have a contact here in the UK who actually provides a service for authors to help them with the police procedure. And it was something for me, even though I was writing a thriller, not necessarily a police procedural, there's elements in the book in the sanatorium. She's not kind of working properly, as it were. She was on a career break. And there are elements I had to research with the Swiss police, but here back in the UK, it was kind of imperative I get those elements right. And yeah, kind of when I'm sort of plotting the book at the very early stages, I almost have like a brainstorming session with him, working out what would and wouldn't be plausible, what would work, where perhaps we could stretch the boundaries a little bit in order to sort of keep the pace up and that kind of thing. And I have to say, I probably have him a little bit on speed dial as the book was progressing. I think he kind of said, contact me if there are any more questions. And yeah, I like to get into detail. So we were emailing back and forth quite regularly.
That's so fun too. I think the one interesting thing about being a writer is that you get to just be so incredibly nosy and you get to ask people questions, and people often will give you a surprising amount of access because they like having someone ask about their work and the difficulties of their work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something, it's quite interesting for him as a role. He's obviously retired now. I'm trying to think how many years, it's probably maybe like 30 years he was working as a detective in various kind of departments. And yeah, so many interesting stories. And it's really hard actually when I'm researching. I tend to research a lot. So it's really hard not to kind of go down one sort of thread. He was giving me sort of lots of ideas just by speaking. And I was thinking, could I weave that idea in? But I kind of had to restrain myself and sort of stick to what I was planning. But yeah, I definitely sort of found ideas for future books just by speaking to him.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's the good thing about having a series. At least you know what you can sort of use in the future. I was wondering also with having a series, so Elin, did you know with the first book that you wanted to continue with Elin, and how much did you sort of lay seeds for the second and the third book, or how are you envisioning the overall series plotting out?
Yeah, when I sort of had the idea for the sanatorium, the idea very much came with the idea for the, I suppose, the building, and the idea it was kind of going to be a crime thriller, I suppose. But I did have Eleanor's character sort of, I suppose, seeded a little bit in my short fiction. And when I sort of decided upon her being a detective, we start the sanatorium quite an unusual place where she's on this break. She's kind of very vulnerable, sort of both personally and professionally. And I kind of did really see her journey continuing beyond the sanatorium. She obviously has a case. She's not properly working. She's kind of helping the Swiss police out. But I was really intrigued to see her kind of back at work, and I suppose in more of a stable place. So yeah, I did have this idea she would kind of continue. And there's also sort of a secondary, I suppose, narrative about running through both the sanatorium and the retreat. There's this idea of sort of perhaps a past case or someone watching Elin, something lingering from the past, kind of pulling on that idea of the past, sort of echoed in both the central plots of both books. And yeah, I see that sort of continuing into book 3. But there are elements that kind of definitely evolved. I wouldn't say I had every part of the books planned out, but yeah, I definitely seeded book 2 within the first, and then within book 2 I was thinking about book 3, so it was a bit of a balancing act.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great because they read so beautifully on their own, and then they have all these reverberations when you put them together, which is probably really satisfying for you, but also incredibly difficult. I was wondering, how do you sort of clear the decks between projects? Or you're continuing with Elin, but you presumably have a break in between, or what do you do to sort of gear up for the next one when it's such a marathon?
Just having a complete break, I think. I'm hugely sort of I like to immerse myself in nature, shall we say, so I kind of like to be constantly outdoors, and I think taking a total break and kind of perhaps reading outside of sort of thrillers and that kind of thing. But as I said, I do find it quite hard because I know I'm writing another Elin book, so as I said before, sort of step outside of her head. So yeah, it is challenging, but I think one of the things I'm trying to do with the series, and hopefully it's working, is just trying to do something a little bit different with each one. So I think in the sanatorium we've got Elin's point of view, and then we also have sort of the victim's point of view. And then in the retreat we have Elin, and she's obviously, you know, one of the central characters, but we also have Hannah, who's part of the family group. And I think sort of keeping it fresh in terms of, even though it's a series and Elin as a character is continuing, the plot, as you kind of mentioned, sort of work as a standalone, and just trying to mix up the form a little bit, and kind of the idea of that sort of almost story within a story with Hannah. yeah, has really helped kind of clear my mind. And I think in book 3 I'm going to do something slightly different again, so that really helps. It doesn't feel like, yeah, I'm just totally working with one set of characters in that sense.
Yeah, I really loved with the retreat what a wide cast of characters you have, and especially having them all in one location and in such close proximity, and getting some of their backstories or the intricacies of their relationships and all the tension between the siblings. How did you work that out? Did you sort of plot it out or graph it out, or how did you keep everyone's storylines interwoven?
Yeah, that was actually such a good question, because it was really quite hard at the beginning, because I had the two sort of, without giving too much away, the sort of sister characters, and then Maya, who's the cousin, kind of came in a little bit later, and yeah, it was quite a juggling act, I suppose, working out kind of, yeah, the sort of conflict between them, I suppose, and sort of how that would all work. I think as the book goes on, kind of you're drip fed more and more information about sort of how the relationships are tied together and what has gone on. I think as the reader, you're much more aware than Elin is as she's progressing, the dynamics between them because of sort of Hannah's narration. But yeah, it was extremely tricky, and it was a lot of sort of planning and drawing things out. I'm quite a visual person, so I have a notebook and kind of drew out sort of the relationships and how things worked. But actually some of it evolved as the book went on. I think we have quite a few sort of scenes of conflict between the characters, and from those scenes of conflict kind of came more conflict as I got to know them. So yeah, it's sort of a process of planning, and then also, yeah, just seeing how it goes when the characters meet, I suppose, in the book.
Yeah, and so much of the conflict that exists between them is conflict that feels like we're coming in on when they're at this stage in their adulthood, but that it's been there since they were tiny children. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sibling order and the family dynamics and how you brought all that into play in the novel.
Yeah, that's something that really fascinates me, actually, is the sort of relationship between siblings. In the sanatorium, we see Elin, our detective, with Isaac, her brother, and they haven't kind of seen each other for a little while. And that was a really sort of fun thing to work with. And in this book, it's not quite the same, but there is an element of estrangement between the sisters and the cousins. And we start off with kind of knowing that basically they kind of made a sort of unshakable bond between them when they were children. And as they've got older, that sort of bond has stretched apart. And yeah, I'm kind of intrigued by the idea of how much you ever know sort of anyone, even those people closest to you. And I think with siblings, when you grow up together, you're in the same house, you know, you're hugely sort of physically intimate in that sense. You kind of share your thoughts, arguments, all that kind of thing. But yeah, as you get older, do those sort of bonds weaken because you become different people, or do you realize, did you ever know those people that well at all, even though you shared the same house? And I think there's so much people kind of keep internally. And yeah, I think also sort of sibling order perhaps plays a role in that, and how people are seen in the family. We have the point of view of Hannah, who's sort of the sibling, I suppose, who's the moderator. So she's kind of the counterbalance between the two other sisters. And I think we see sort of her as she gets older, she feels almost trapped by that. And in the book, she sort of wants to try and break free of everything that's kind of hemmed her into that sort of family dynamic. And yeah, I think probably with quite explosive consequences.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it so satisfying too, is that all the conflict and the sort of tension or the fear is coming out of these characters' relationships with one another. So it's not just a threat looming from outside them. You know, it feels like they could destroy one another at any moment, which feels really explosive and
Yeah,
probably quite fun to write. Like the characters' minds of their own.
Yeah, exactly. I think that kind of dynamic between them, when I was writing it, I was kind of genuinely feeling quite on edge. I think there's a line in the book, kind of like a pressure cooker ready to sort of pop, and it really did feel like that. And yeah, I think as a writer, when you feel scenes kind of could go any way, it's quite exciting.
Yeah, I know people from our publisher are probably listening, and I had to ask for an extension for my new book because of having COVID and childcare not working. And I was wondering, how did you actually manage it during the pandemic? And I don't know if you love this too. I really love reading like a day in the life of writers and when they start writing and when they stop. So when you're sort of in full flow, what does a writing day look like for you?
Oh yeah, so a writing day sort of pre-pandemic, I'm guessing would have been kind of my children go to school, yeah, do the school run, and then I kind of always actually start my writing day with some form of exercise. So in the summer it could kind of be a swim, or in the winter kind of a run or a walk, and I genuinely find for me that sort of kind of resets the day. I kind of move out of sort of family mode into kind of writing mode, and then actually I would write kind of more or less continually until my children finish school. And I tend to be more of a sort of a morning person anyway, so yeah, that kind of natural cut off at the end of the day when the children are back home worked, and then if I could fit anything in sort of before meal times, I would. But by the evening, yeah, I'm not working so much. If I'm editing, I can work in the evening, but that kind of first draft, it tends to be more in the day. But yeah, for me in the pandemic, it was probably quite similar to you. I think I probably had an extension or two. Yeah, I found it really, really hard. I'm quite an introvert by nature as well. And I think I probably got used to the rhythm after sort of toddlerhood, where you're with the children all the time. I'd got used to sort of time and space on my own. And obviously my husband, you know, would be working or traveling away for work. So having everyone in the house, I found kind of really quite hard creatively. And yeah, I found my writing was sort of, because of homeschooling, kind of squeezed into weekends and time when I'd normally relax. So yeah, it was extremely traumatic in some respects, but yeah, I think in a way the extra time probably gave me more space from the manuscript at points, which was helpful in terms of the final process, probably more so than I would have done otherwise. But yeah, it felt like quite a tough book to write sometimes.
Yeah, I know. There was the writer Maggie O'Farrell said that at one point she was hiding in her kids' dollhouse or treehouse in their yard, trying to find 2 hours to write on her laptop just frantically before she was found. But I think what's impressive is the retreat feels like a book that you could have just sat down and ran straight through without any kind of just struggle. Like, it feels really effortlessly compelling. So I love that about books, that all of the kind of work that goes on under the surface can get kind of hidden by the final project somehow. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, no, I do know just what you mean. It's kind of amazing when you read back through a book or someone else's work. And I don't think, to be honest, until you write a book yourself, do you see kind of those layers that go into the writing process as well. I think it's not just from the first draft, it's kind of the time taken away and then the thoughts that you add to that and kind of what you remove and then what you add in. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you don't see those kind of sub layers. So yeah, I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, I know you studied broadcast journalism. I was wondering how other forms of writing inform your fiction writing. I also was wondering if you've ever done screenwriting or if you block out films or TV shows, because the writing's so cinematic and it feels so beautifully almost directed. So I was wondering if that's something that you do as well.
Yeah, no, not necessarily, actually. I think probably the cinematic side of things, I very much kind of, I suppose, see my scenes, almost see my chapters almost as scenes. See, I actually said scenes there. I kind of do see them as scenes, and I think it's probably going back to kind of what you said as the method acting approach. I very much feel I am the characters when I'm writing, and I think probably it's a sign for me that a scene's going well when I am there. I think it's time up for me to know to take a step back when it's feeling awkward and I feel like I'm kind of outside of the action. And often those scenes that kind of, when it comes to the editing process, both with myself and my editors, the scenes where I felt fully immersed are the ones that get changed the least. So it's a sign, but it's hard when you're on deadline. You don't always feel that way. So yeah, it's a kind of, it's an interesting process, I think, when you go back through.
Yeah, there's a really long, I don't want to do any spoilers for people who haven't finished yet, but there's a really long sort of set piece scene towards the end where Ellen's in danger, and it felt so visceral. It felt like you're so close to her. I love that. I know the rare Gillian Flynn says that when she finishes writing, she'll like put on music and dance around the room before she goes upstairs to her family, because she's writing about these like toxic marriages or murder, yes, horrible subjects. And then I was wondering, do you do anything to sort of decompress when you're coming up from writing a scene like that?
Yeah, I just kind of probably actually, even I don't kind of necessarily sort of get into some mode before seeing my family. I think it's genuinely seeing my children. They're probably at the age now where they kind of are just, talking so much and so immersive. So I just go and see my family, and I find genuinely within about sort of 5 minutes, the writing has slipped away. But I often find kind of before I'm drifting off to sleep, actually, I kind of go back into the book. And I often wonder whether it's a subconscious thing, actually. You're not thinking about the book, but your mind's in that mode where you're relaxing and you realize you are carrying that book with you. And I think it's probably not until after I finish the editing process, maybe even like a month after, do I kind of gradually start to let the book go. I think my mind's constantly processing a book, and that's why I think sometimes that extra time, as I said, during the pandemic definitely helped, because I think my brain definitely had more time to work on it probably than I otherwise would have.
Yeah, it is really special when you get to that point where you're on a bus or you're driving and it's just sort of coming up to you, bubbling up. Do you think so, as someone who's writing thrillers or crime stories. I was wondering why you think people are so drawn to them, or why you're drawn to them. What about thrillers is so appealing to you?
Yeah, I've always loved thrillers. One of the things is kind of, I think for me as well, I suppose I go through phases with my reading, and obviously probably with my writing as well. But I think I'm not necessarily a mood reader with thrillers. I think depending on other kind of genres, I have to be in the right frame of mind. But I think with a thriller, it's a book I can kind of, a genre I can always pick up and kind of become immersed in, and that kind of is what drew me to writing them. And I think probably again with having children and things, I was drawn to something, I suppose, a book where I feel like I could accomplish things quite quickly as I could with short fiction. And I think that kind of almost scene by scene, as you mentioned, and chapter by chapter, the pace of a thriller really appealed from a writing. And I'm also genuinely sort of drawn to the dark side and kind of understanding what makes people tick, and why people do the bad things that they do. I always remember reading The Talented Mr. Ripley for the first time and just being awestruck by kind of how she managed to sort of make the character appealing, but also kind of you were just amazed by how he could feel that way. And I think that's something in my fiction, I like to explore how someone gets to that point. And without giving anything away about the book, there's a kind of scene at the end and a character who hopefully people haven't thought lots about maybe, but yeah, I was fascinated by how she got to that point, and that is so interesting to construct, I think. So yeah, I think that's what drew me.
Yeah, that's lovely. Can you tell us anything about the third book, or are you under an oath of secrecy?
Not necessarily an oath of secrecy, but I'm kind of in the early stages. But yeah, Elin's back, and the kind of sort of narrative thread we're following, sort of secondary thread through book 1 and 2, is kind of a little bit tied up. I think the interesting thing with Elin to write as a character is she's quite complex, and I as an author don't always feel like I know her, and I know readers have said sort of a similar thing. And yeah, we find out a lot more about her in the third book, so yeah, it's exciting to write.
I can have about 7,000 more questions I would love to ask you, but I was wondering, Kristen and Abby, if you want to ask the audience.
Yeah, we definitely have some questions coming in, and some in the queue as well. So if you are ready, I can start firing them at you. So you know what? Let's take let's take it back to the origins. So Courtney McCarroll would like to know, can you speak to your beginnings as a writer? Who or what inspired you to pursue this kind of career? And since you were sort of talking about the sort of scene element in which you're, the way that you're writing, what do you think that writing allows you to do that other mediums might not?
Yeah, that's such a good question, actually. I think writing as a medium is very interactive. I think it probably uses a different sort of part of your brain. I find it quite kind of meditative for me. And I think my beginnings as a writer is just the world building aspect of reading, I suppose. I think I started off just loving books that completely transported me, and where, I built a new world in my head. And I think that's something I sort of strive to do with my books, even though they're thriller. And I know sort of the world building aspect is often looked upon as sort of the fantasy world, but I just love having kind of atmospheric settings where the reader can be transported, and I can be too. And I just find it, for me, it's a meditative act doing that. And I love being sort of transported by the actual writing process itself, I suppose.
Lovely. Now, you were talking earlier about the conflict that you're sort of working to create between characters. And again, we're not going to give too much away. We had a previous author who came to RJ Julia who is describing how she created conflict between characters. And she talked about this. I still think about it. It was like this coefficient of tension, and she had it was like a statistical analysis of her characters over time. And it reminds me of your character mapping, that you were describing earlier. So my question to that regard is, how do you know, especially in a thriller when it's so critical, how do you know when you're getting the pacing right?
Yeah, it's a really hard thing, actually. And I think it's something, as sort of Flynn and I were saying, about sort of layering. I don't think you always get it necessarily right in the first draft, particularly kind of in scenes between characters. I think it's something I probably do it on a read through and work out sort of how things are working. But I think for me, probably every chapter has some kind of conflict or tension. I think sometimes I'll have seen where perhaps there's too much description, or I'm trying to do something else. But I think I'm probably working towards that moment of tension and not necessarily resolution, depending on what's coming in the next chapter. In almost every scene that I write. And it might not necessarily kind of be a tension necessarily between the characters. It might be something in the landscape. It might be something that's sort of moving the plot along. But yeah, I suppose it's there in everything. And I kind of have to think about that before I'm writing the scene. And that comes in the sort of planning stages, I suppose. But there's definitely elements, as I said to Flynn before, that kind of come as you're writing. And I think it's quite exciting when sort of tensions bubble up that you hadn't quite planned on, either through a conversation or an interaction between the characters. So yeah.
Keep it tense, ladies and gentlemen. So this is a question for both Sarah and Flynn. If you could give one piece of advice to your protagonist, what would it be? And one piece of advice do you think that they might give you?
Oh gosh.
That's such a good question. I thought you were going to say to aspiring writers. And I was like,
yeah, so did I.
Do you want to go first, Sarah?
Yeah, I think probably my advice to Elin would be to think about things a little bit more. I think Ellen's really spontaneous as a character, and actually I found her really exciting to write because she's pushing the envelope quite a lot in a way that I wouldn't do. And I do like putting my characters in situations and doing things I wouldn't do. So she can be quite confrontational. She can be quite judgmental. She says things to people that, yeah, I wouldn't do. So I'd probably say pull back a little bit sometimes, but then on reflection, it might not make her such a fun character to write. And yeah, probably her advice to me would be to don't put her in those situations.
Put me on a beach, woman. No murder.
Yeah, exactly. Let me relax for once.
Yeah, I feel similarly. I feel like my advice to Tessa, who's my main character in the current book and in Northern Spy, would just be that to sort of hold on tight and that things will get easier, because it is, when you're writing a novel, you're just giving them hell, to be honest. Like, you're taking a character. Someone said that the whole principle of drama is you're taking a character you like, and then you're just giving them hardship after hardship after hardship and sort of seeing how they respond. And sometimes it does feel like when you adore a character so much, it can almost feel difficult to be putting them through that. And I think her advice to me would be probably similar about right now I'm in the stage of parenting where it feels so overwhelming because our kids are so little. Like this afternoon, I was at the urgent care right before I got here, rushing to get here. And I think her advice for that too would just be that it's normal and it's okay for things to feel completely kind of out of control for the early years and the sticky years and the kind of messy years.
Oh, could I just say one thing actually with Flynn, with Northern Spy, that I thought you did so well, was the sort of almost documenting sort of motherhood with all of that sort of tension running alongside it. It was kind of like you were saying, you were sort of piling on tension. Not only was she kind of dealing with new motherhood, but obviously the loss of her sister and wondering what she was doing at the beginning. I thought that was so clever how that layered up. You could kind of feel that sort of tension of new motherhood. I don't know where you were, which stage you were at with your parenting journey at the time, but you kind of captured that so well, that baby phase. It was brilliant.
Thank you. It's okay. Yeah, I wrote sort of in real time. So my son was the same age as the baby in the book and kind of aging with him, which is really fun.
You both are very, very good at incorporating sort of real life experiences into your work.
Thank you.
So on the subject of characters, I always think it's interesting to see how a character changes over the course, of a single work. Any good character is dynamic, but it's especially interesting to trace a character over a series. Knowing that we have a third book coming, and now that you've spent 2 books in Elin's shoes, how have you seen her character grow? And if this isn't too much to anticipate for spoilers, I know you're in early stages. How do you anticipate she might continue to change?
Yeah, I think in book 1, as I mentioned before, we kind of meet Elin where she's kind of dealing very much with sort of, I suppose, professional trauma and sort of personal trauma. She's sort of lots of unanswered questions, and I don't think she kind of trusts herself very much. She sort of looks around her, and particularly to her partner Will, I suppose, for a lot of sort of reassurance. And she's, I guess you kind of call it the imposter syndrome at work. She's wondering, will she return to work? And we see all of those vulnerabilities really sort of laid out on the page in quite a raw way. And yeah, it makes Elin, I suppose, quite a complex character to write, but quite an exciting one. I think in the Sanatorium, we see her go on a bit of a journey. We see her sort of some of that former strength come back. But yeah, she's still doubtful. And I think in the retreat, we see her sort of plunged by her boss into a case which looks like it's going to be straightforward, but it turns out to be sort of almost anything but. And she very much grows, I think, as a person. She has a partner alongside her, Steed, as well. And I think that sort of dynamic isn't a reliance. I think they kind of both see things in each other that, both help them kind of with the case. And I think sort of towards the end of the book, she's learning that she doesn't need to draw on sort of strength from other people, but from herself. And yeah, without kind of giving any sort of spoilers away about book 3, I think we sort of see that, reliance on Will as a person, and see how that evolves a little bit more. Yeah.
And so to kind of build on that, one of our audience members observed that she'd never really thought about detectives as experiencing panic attacks. You think of these individuals as incredibly competent and capable. It seems the attacks would be so frequent based on the work that they do. Did your police consultant talk about how common that is or is not in the field?
No, he didn't. I think for me, it was very much almost looking around at just people I know, if I'm being honest, and how they cope with those kind of feelings of anxiety, just generally in the workplace. And I was really intrigued, and I know it's made for quite tough reading for some people actually, to kind of see sort of someone in a professional role, and would they really be able to function with that? People absolutely do. People have those kind of panic attacks, they have those feelings of anxiety, or whether it's a full-blown panic attack or not. And they sort of have to learn to kind of cope with them, I think, in a way. And yeah, I wanted it to sort of, I suppose, explore the fact that people do have these feelings and they do function in roles, and to kind of give that airtime. I think, yeah, panic and anxiety is often spoken about, not in hushed tones, but I think it's a bit of a taboo in certain professions. And I sort of wanted to peel that open a little bit.
I love that. To kind of pivot a little bit, if you are writing a book, and now we talked a lot about the immersive quality of this book, the transportive, scene that you provide. I know that the Sanatorium sort of grew out of your experiences living in Switzerland, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Now, if you're writing a book where the place kind of takes on almost becomes almost a character of its own, do you feel like you need to travel to that place in order to incorporate that setting effectively? And how much time do you think you need to spend there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't think it's an absolute essential, and I think there's so many kind of tools online now where you can kind of virtually visit places and things, but I think for me, definitely, I do like to sort of know the place. I think there's a sort of level of detail as a writer you kind of like, I suppose, just even from smells and sounds and sort of textures and all the things you kind of pick up in that environment. And I think also just speaking to kind of local people and experiencing what happens there. And I don't mean what happens in anything dramatic. I think just being in that one place and just listening. For me, I like to kind of just listen. I think you learn so much, not just from conversation, obviously, and people talking, but just listening to the sounds of nature and everything that's around you. And I personally would struggle, I think, to describe somewhere effectively if I hadn't been there. But yeah, I'm sure other people don't feel it's necessary.
I like that answer though, because I will use that as, an excuse to go places.
I don't know, Flynn, do you feel the same or?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best part about being a writer is that you get to just leave your current life behind and lead all these other lives that you wouldn't get a chance to otherwise. And part of that is having another landscape alongside your own landscape and getting to smell it and see it. There's a writer named Louise Dowdy who has a book about novel writing that I really love and recommend. And she talks about how you can always visit your novel, even if you're writing like a fantasy novel about dragons. You can go for a walk in the woods and look at the fallen tree stumps and the kind of craggy rocks. And or if you're writing a book set in medieval times, you can drink mead, or there's always a way to sort of get inside that landscape. And I just love that idea of going traveling into your novel, however you do it.
I love that. So this is also an audience question, and I'll sort of build on that a little bit. You are both lovely people with, beautifully curated pottery behind you. And we spent most of our time before this event officially began discussing puppies and small children. And so one of our audience members rather astutely would like to ask, what draws you to writing thrillers?
Flynn, do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's this kind of, it's a few things. I think as a woman, there's a kind of vigilance that you're doing automatically all the time that you don't even know you're doing. If you're walking alone down a street at night, you might feel totally sort of preoccupied with your own life, and you're thinking about your friends that you just left, or you're thinking about your work, but some part of your brain is also scanning the people walking towards you and saying, is that person a threat or not? And I got really angry about that in my 20s, that was something I lived with. I remember I asked my now husband if he had ever felt scared of another person, and he said, no, never. He had never once worried about his personal safety. And that's just so foreign to me as a woman. So I sort of was writing thrillers as a kind of catharsis, I think, to work against that fear, that awareness. And then something really interesting happened when I had a baby, where I read once that your amygdala grows when you have a baby, or when you're pregnant, that the part of your brain that controls fear, because you're constantly scanning for choking hazards or any sort of thing that could cause harm to the baby. And you're in that really liminal state where you're not sleeping, you're up alone and in the house at night, you're looking out the window. And so that felt like really rich territory too, to sort of talk about fear or tension or that kind of protectiveness, I think.
Yeah, I think Flynn makes a really interesting point there. As a woman, I think you are generally, I compare just myself to my husband actually, and all of the fears I see that he doesn't. And I'm sure that, as you mentioned, there's probably a scientific kind of reason for that. And yeah, I think sort of thriller writing definitely stems from that. And as I said before, I think for me, kind of thriller and crime in general, I'm just fascinated by kind of what makes people tick and what makes people kind of do bad things. And yeah, I definitely think there's an element as well of exploring, as Finn mentioned, your own sort of fears and sort of pushing your character. In my case, it's definitely my character to limits, and seeing, I suppose, what my limits would be and what I would do, but kind of in a safe space, I suppose.
So interesting. It's the same. I'm often going for walks. You know, I pass young women who have the murder podcasts on as they're walking, and I think that it's fascinating because it represents a certain, as you said, that sort of, you know, it's both fascinating for a woman and it sort of serves as a sort of training in some capacity. Like, these are the ways in which I might prepare myself for, you know, oncoming attacks, and a defense mechanism. Because as you walk by someone who is listening to someone describe very calmly a brutal murder scene, it makes you pause before approaching them.
Yeah. There's a definite pause before you do anything.
I'm a kindred spirit in that way. So I'm like, which episode is this? But I can imagine that it would off-put some people.
There's a podcast host who talks about the exact thing, where she's like, in a way, this is like a how-to manual for survival. Like, we're all sort of plotting out worst case scenarios, which is so odd to think about. But I like the idea, Sarah, that you're sort of testing yourself in a safe place and seeing, what would my limits be? How would I respond? But in a condition of safety, and not, you know, the real life.
It's very firmly in my safe cocoon, as opposed to being out there. But yeah.
Another question that's come through is, speaking of the place as almost another character, how do you get to the historical aspects of them? Visiting can kind of be a little bit different, you know, if you're going now and writing a novel that took place 200 years ago, for example, the place is different. Do you focus on historical primary sources from the place, or somewhere similar to it?
Yeah, for me, a lot of my research, actually, we have a really good sort of local museum where I've researched sort of local history and actually sort of eyewitness kind of accounts of things as well, which is really helpful. And then actually a lot of kind of online conversation. The Reddit thread I actually feature in my book about the boarding school actually exists. And I found this fascinating, and it's kind of a public, in the book, I actually kind of take it privately, because I kind of think, would people discuss things? But I was genuinely amazed that people do in those kind of sort of chat spaces. So yeah, for me, it's a real sort of mixture of researching methods, and obviously via book and things as well. But yeah, I was genuinely amazed by sort of how open people are online. And it feels horribly voyeuristic looking into people's experiences. But yeah, I think it can be really useful as a writer. And as Flynn said, I think as an author, you're sort of hungry for that information. But yeah, a mix.
A mix. Now, you talked a little bit earlier about sort of when you're not writing deliciously paced thrillers, sometimes you will pivot and read other things, to kind of a palate cleanser, to clear the mind, to kind of gain inspiration from other places. I've heard artists kind of describe like the creative inhale versus the creative exhale. You know, the exhale is when you're writing, when you're creating, when you're producing. The creative inhale is when you're, you know, looking at art and reading books and things like that. So to both of you, I might ask, what are you reading these days?
Oh yeah, I'll go ahead. I'm actually my creative inhale or exhale, not sure which one. I'm actually about to get started on a proof, Jane Harper's new novel, Exiles. I think you're talking about kind of atmospheric thrillers. One thing I love about Jane Harper's books is just how the sort of landscape again becomes a sort of character in its own right. So I'm getting started on that. But I'm also reading a wonderful book of poetry called Time is a Mother by Ocean Vuong. It's sort of about the loss of his mother, but I love sort of just reading something completely different from kind of what I'm writing, and I love the sort of playfulness of the short form. So that's a book that's I found a book of poetry I found really deeply moving, actually.
Yeah, and I'm reading this book called Grown Ups. I think it's tremendous. It's not a thriller. It has short chapters. It's by a Norwegian writer, and it's about two sisters at their family's vacation cabin on a fjord in Norway and all the tensions that they have. And it is completely wonderful. It has, similar to The Retreat, it has what feels like just these really authentic, layered family relationships where you can feel both the love and also the kind of way they can push each other's buttons and drive themselves just into like complete knots. And it's just really beautifully written. I know everything gets compared to Sally Rooney these days, but it has that same kind of sort of low-key writing style that feels really genuine and authentic and kind of satisfying. And it's very good for summer because it's hot, it's sunny, they're on the water.
Another atmospheric book, you know, take me to the beach. A good idea to put your characters on the beach. I'm just saying, a nice cocktail never hurt anybody. One other question that came through in terms of third books and where we will be putting Elin next. The first, between Sanatorium and The Retreat, there, as you were talking about earlier, there's definitely a shift in narrative style, which is always interesting and keeps it fresh. And, you know, again, kind of gave you the chance to talk about different characters or see through different characters' eyes. Yeah. You anticipate that the style in the third book will change again, be an amalgamation of the two? Maybe we don't know yet. We're still deciding.
Yeah, I'm playing a little bit with the idea of sort of a first person narration as well. But yeah, I'm kind of going to see, I think for me, as we mentioned before, it's kind of in terms of sort of keeping it fresh, it's really helpful to be doing something a little bit different between the books. But yeah, probably a mixture of the two. We're definitely obviously going to have Ellen's point of view again, but one thing I loved about writing The Retreat was having that other point of view. And I think with what I'm doing in the third book, with sort of bringing this sort of simmering story we've got kind of lying underneath both coming to a head in the third, I think we really need that other point of view again to sort of work out exactly what happened and why, and that's probably as much as I can say.
Excellent. And then I think that's all the questions that we have for this evening.
Can I ask a quick question?
You can. Please do.
Without asking about plot or anything, when you're at this stage of the book with the third one, are you sort of like making a scrapbook of images? Are you writing new material on longhand or on your computer? Like what's your actual sort of physical writing process like right now?
Oh, yeah, that's a really interesting question actually when you said about the longhand, because there's scenes I've written kind of on my laptop, but actually I've gone back, I've got like a big notebook and I've gone back to kind of, I guess I'm writing myself into the book initially. So I've kind of got scenes that I'm really, really excited about, and I kind of start with them and sort of write my way into the character. But actually the voice of the person that I'm sort of experimenting with a little bit, she's kind of come to me fully formed, which is, so I get quite an exciting moment. And yeah, I haven't quite had it. I had it with Elin to a degree, but this other character, I'm kind of sort of Roaring Away with Her and Longhand. And yeah, I haven't written longhand in this way for a while, so I'm sort of filling with scenes, but yeah, definitely images as well. But I'm also traveling to the location to kind of get more imagery. But yeah, at the moment it's just sort of exploring particularly this one character, which is yeah, really exciting.
We can tell you're very excited about her. She sounds
Sorry,
really
it's just that wonderful feeling where you just want to write and write and write.
I got the honeymoon phase with a new character. How lovely.
Yeah, it is, but it's really hard because I kind of dipped in. I'm sure it's like my brain doing something to me. I kind of dipped into it just before all of the publicity started for the retreat. So I'm at the stage where I'm desperate to kind of write, but can't quite because I'm quite busy. So yeah, I'm kind of waiting to dive back in.
But it's interesting what you say about longhand too, because it is like the form is so important, I think, when we're starting out, because when you're typing, I feel like your fingers at a certain point can move faster than your brain. So it's nice to be able to take the time and kind of think through the character, you know, as you're writing it. There's something nice about it. It's tactile. It's like traveling to the place to write.
Yeah, and I have a thing as well when I'm editing, which if my editor's watching, yeah, I kind of have to print things off to edit effectively, which probably slows my process compared to authors who can kind of do everything on screen. But I don't know what it's a hangover of, whether kind of I associate kind of screen with sort of news and kind of not really digesting things effectively, or kind of social media, but I find I kind of really do need to print off to kind of get under the skin of the scene. So yeah, just even having the sort of physical form is definitely, I think it uses a different part of my brain. Genuinely, I don't know.
So interesting. Well, I am even more excited now for the third book than ever. I can't wait to meet the the lovely new character who has you so excited.
Thank you.
Flynn, did you have any more burning questions?
No, thank you. That will hold me off for a few months.
Now I want to ask more. So this has had the opposite effect, but I know it is much later for Sarah than it is for the rest of us this evening. So I think with that, I want to thank you both on behalf of RJ Julia and RJ Julia Wesleyan for joining us this evening, as well as all of our lovely attendees. Thank you so much. Please consider buying a copy of Sarah Pearse's book and Flynn Berry's book. They're both spectacular. I can recommend them personally and very highly. Snatch them up quickly. Links are in the chat as always. And thank you both again so much for joining us here tonight.
Oh, thank you.
My pleasure. And thank you to you and to Flynn as well for the great questions. Thank you.
Of course. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.